On flight AF 723 from Paris to Ouagadougou, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was tense and hurried. Passengers were already settled, many of them European businessmen on their way to an important international economic conference. Sophie Lamer, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience, moved quickly and professionally through the aisle, finishing her pre-departure checks. But just as the doors were about to close, a message came through the intercom from the cabin chief, a high-profile passenger, Mr. Demary, vice president of Globiex Industries, had missed his earlier flight and urgently needed a seat in first class. Sophie felt a familiar wave of pressure wash over her. These last-minute changes always stirred up tension. Could someone be convinced to move to business class, she wondered. Compensation and travel vouchers were usually enough to persuade a willing passenger, but it was never easy. She scanned the cabin carefully, evaluating who might be most likely to agree. Her eyes landed on a quiet man sitting near the window, a black man dressed in a plain beige shirt and dark trousers, reading a thick book about African economics. He looked calm, composed, and solitary. Unlike the other first-class passengers in tailored suits and designer watches, he didn't stand out as someone important. Judging him by his modest appearance, Sophie made a quick decision. Approaching him with a polite but firm smile, she prepared to ask the favor. Internally, she hoped he would accept without much protest. She didn't have time for conflict, and in her mind, he seemed the least likely to cause trouble. What she didn't know was that this simple moment would soon become one of the most humbling experiences of her life. Sophie approached the man with her usual professional demeanor, but inside, she felt the pressure of the situation tightening around her. She took a shallow breath, put on a composed smile, and leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice polite yet assertive. "We're facing an unusual situation. A high-priority passenger must be seated in first class. Would you be willing to move to business class? The airline will, of course, provide you with compensation and a travel voucher for another trip." The man looked up slowly from his book, an academic volume titled An Essay on the African Economy. His glasses had slipped down the bridge of his nose, and he adjusted them slightly as he studied Sophie's face. His eyes were dark, thoughtful, and calm, not the eyes of someone easily rattled. "Is there a problem with me being here?" he asked, his tone soft but steady, tinged with the smooth cadence of a Burkinabe accent. For a moment, Sophie's confidence faltered. The directness of his question caught her off guard. She quickly collected herself, trying to hide the slight flush rising to her cheeks. "No, sir," she replied, almost too quickly. "It's just, this particular passenger is of very high status. It's a matter of priority. We're required to make accommodations in such cases." Around them, a few curious glances were exchanged among the other first-class passengers. Sophie could feel their eyes lingering, waiting to see how the man would react. But he didn't sigh, didn't frown, didn't argue. Instead, he calmly reached for a leather bookmark and marked his page with care. Then, with quiet dignity, he slid the book into a well-used but elegant brown leather bag. "I will change my seat," he said, his voice still composed, almost gentle. He stood slowly, deliberately, with the grace of someone completely at peace with himself. There was no trace of bitterness, no indignation in his expression. Sophie blinked in surprise. She had been prepared for resistance, perhaps even frustration. But what she got instead was simple, unshaken grace. It disarmed her. "Thank you for your understanding, sir," she murmured, almost feeling undeserving of his patience. She glanced at the passenger list to confirm his name. "Mr. Traore," she said, making a note. He nodded politely in response. As she guided him down the aisle toward the business class cabin, Sophie found herself oddly unsettled. The man didn't complain, didn't question the logic behind the decision, didn't even ask about the compensation. There was a quiet strength in his silence, something that made her wonder, if only for a second, whether she had misjudged him. But she shook the thought away. After all, he had agreed without protest. That was all that mattered. Or so she thought. 2 hours into the flight, as the aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds, Sophie was busy in business class, carefully distributing meals and checking on passengers. The routine was comforting, a rhythm she knew by heart. But then, Amina, a young and attentive flight attendant from Senegal, approached her with an expression that made Sophie pause immediately. Amina's face was pale with disbelief, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie," she said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no passengers were listening. "Do you know who that man is, the one you moved from first class?" Sophie frowned. "Mr. Traore? What about him?" Amina leaned in even closer, her eyes wide. "That's Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso." The tray in Sophie's hands trembled, and for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, stunned. No, it can't be. He's traveling alone. No security, no assistance, presidents don't fly that way. Amina nodded quickly. He does. He's known for it. Discreet diplomatic missions. The captain was just informed by air control in Ouagadougou. A government delegation will be meeting him on the tarmac. It's really him. Sophie's heart dropped like a stone in her chest. She turned slowly to look toward the business class window seat where Mr. Traore sat. He was completely at ease, sipping tea, his book open again on his lap. There was no trace of arrogance, no attempt to draw attention to himself. He was still just as calm and composed as when she had first spoken to him. And that was when the full weight of her earlier action crashed down on her. She had judged him. She had assumed he didn't belong in first class because of the way he dressed, a plain beige shirt and worn leather bag among expensive suits and polished shoes. She hadn't asked who he was or why he was there. She had simply looked at him and decided he was the least important. Her face flushed with shame. Her throat tightened. I asked the president of a country to give up his seat, she whispered, barely able to say the words. Amina nodded sympathetically. Yes. And he did it without hesitation. That's who he is. Humble. Quiet. But deeply respected. Sophie leaned against the service counter, her mind spinning. The memory of his eyes, deep and calm, came back to her. He hadn't argued. He hadn't needed to. His dignity had spoken louder than any title. I didn't see him, Sophie said softly, more to herself than to Amina. Not really. I saw his clothes, his skin, his silence, and I assumed. Amina placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. We've all made that kind of mistake, Sophie. What matters is what you do after. Sophie nodded, her gaze distant, filled with regret. She couldn't shake the feeling of having failed, not just as a professional, but as a person. All the training in customer service, in diplomacy, in respect, none of it mattered if she let bias cloud her judgment in real moments. I need to say something, she said. To him. Not now, Amina warned gently. The captain wants us to keep everything discreet. This trip is sensitive. We can't cause a scene. Sophie sighed, her eyes still fixed on the man she now knew was a head of state. He didn't act like a president, she whispered. He acted like a teacher. For the rest of the flight, Sophie moved through the cabin with a heaviness she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced at President Traore, reading, sipping tea, or simply watching the clouds, her heart ached with remorse. The weight of her misjudgment pressed down harder than any turbulence. What she had seen as a routine request now felt like a moral failure. And even though he had forgiven her with grace, she couldn't yet forgive herself. In the quiet moments between duties, she whispered again to Amina, I judged him by his appearance. That's not who I want to be. Amina smiled gently. Then let this be the moment that changes you. As the soft hum of the plane filled the cabin and a golden-orange light began to seep in from the windows, painting the seats in hues of sunset, Sophie made her way slowly through business class. Her tray was empty, but her thoughts were not. Every step she took toward Ibrahim Traore's seat felt heavier than the last. She wasn't just checking on a passenger, she was carrying the weight of a realization that had shaken her deeply. She paused beside him, taking a quiet breath. He was still reading, the same book on African economics open in his lap, his expression as calm and composed as ever. His presence had a serenity about it, one that made Sophie feel both small and deeply moved. "Can I offer you anything, sir?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been there earlier in the flight. He looked up, eyes warm, and offered a peaceful smile. "No, thank you. Everything is perfect." But everything didn't feel perfect to Sophie. She stood still, torn between professionalism and the need to make something right. Her hands trembled slightly, but she found the courage to continue. "I want to say I'm sorry," she said quietly, barely above a whisper. For asking you to move. That wasn't right." He closed his book slowly and gave her his full attention. His eyes didn't hold anger or offense, only understanding, and something even more disarming, compassion. "You were just doing your job, miss," he said, his voice gentle, almost forgiving. But Sophie shook her head. "No. I wasn't just doing my job. I assumed things about you, because of how you looked. Because you weren't dressed like the others. I made a judgment. A wrong one." There was a long pause, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt reflective. Thoughtful. Then, Ibrahim Traore spoke again, his voice carrying quiet wisdom. "Do you know why I didn't object when you asked me to move?" Sophie met his eyes and shook her head. "Because seats, titles, class, those things don't define who we are. They are illusions, symbols people cling to," he said. "What matters is how we carry ourselves and how we treat each other, especially when no one is watching." His words pierced through her like light breaking through fog. For years, she had taken pride in her poise and professionalism. Yet here she was, learning from a man she had misjudged simply because he didn't match the image of importance others projected. "I feel ashamed," she said, barely able to meet his eyes. "I see now that I failed in that moment." "We all fail at times," he replied, not unkindly. "What matters is that we see the failure, and we choose to grow from it." Then, with a soft smile, he said, "In my country, I try to show that leadership is not about power, it's about service. True leadership doesn't need to be loud or flashy. It shows itself in how we live." Another wave of turbulence passed through the aircraft, rocking it gently. Sophie instinctively reached out to stabilize herself. Ibrahim noticed. "Come," he said, gesturing to the seat beside him. "Sit, just for a moment." Sophie hesitated, her eyes searching as for permission, then she nodded and sat down. For a moment, they said nothing. It was enough just to sit in silence beside someone whose presence demanded no recognition, yet radiated something deeper than rank, quiet dignity. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Who I am doesn't matter in this space. What matters is that we both see each other clearly now. As people. Equal in humanity." Sophie looked at him, her heart full. "You could have said no, and stayed in your seat." He smiled again. "Yes. But would that have changed anything about who I am? About my purpose? I don't think so." Then he turned his eyes to the window, motioning for her to look as well. "And besides, the view is better here." Sophie followed his gaze. Outside, the sky was melting into brilliant colors, layers of orange, pink, and purple folding over one another like a painting coming to life. "I'll never forget this moment," she said quietly. "And neither will I," he replied. "Every day, we're given lessons, some gentle, some difficult. What matters is that we remain open to them." In that moment, as the plane cruised toward its destination, Sophie felt a transformation taking root in her, one that would linger long after the landing gear touched down. As the plane descended toward Ouagadougou, a palpable shift took over the cabin. The hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a soft murmur of voices. Passengers were whispering excitedly, their eyes darting toward the front of the cabin, where the quiet man who had once sat in business class now occupied the seat in first class. Sophie could feel the tension in the air as the news of who he was spread through the plane. It was as if the presence of Ibrahim Traore had transformed the entire atmosphere. What had once been a casual, ordinary flight now felt charged with a sense of reverence and awe. Sophie stood by her station, her hands gripping the back of a seat for support, as the realization of her actions fully hit her. Earlier, she had made a decision based on appearances, moving a man she hadn't recognized from a seat in first class to one in business class, all because he looked less important than the others. Now, she understood that she had unknowingly asked the president of Burkina Faso to give up his seat to accommodate a businessman. Her stomach churned with a mix of shame and disbelief. The sense of embarrassment was overwhelming, and she couldn't shake the thought that she had misjudged him solely based on his appearance. Sophie had come to admire Ibrahim for his quiet dignity. His calm acceptance of the situation, his refusal to make a scene, and his humility in the face of her blunder had all been eye-opening for her. And now, standing there, seeing the passengers around her begin to realize who had been sitting in business class, Sophie felt a deep sense of guilt for not recognizing him sooner. But she knew she had to make it right, not just because of her mistake, but because she had learned something crucial about how we perceive others and how often appearances deceive us. With the final light of the flight approaching, Sophie's mind raced. She had to do something. She had to correct her actions in a way that respected Ibrahim and the lesson he had unwittingly taught her. She knew that simply apologizing would not be enough, she had to show him the respect he deserved. With a deep breath, Sophie made her decision. She walked to the cockpit and spoke to the captain, briefed him on the situation, and, with a quiet resolve, suggested they offer Ibrahim his rightful place in first class for the remainder of the flight. The captain agreed, and with the plan in place, Sophie returned to the cabin with a newfound determination. She approached the businessman, Mr. Damari, the man who had been seated in first class. His earlier irritation still hung in the air, but now he was a little more aware of his surroundings, his posture a bit more guarded as the whispers continued. Sophie approached him with a calm confidence that surprised even her. Her nerves had melted away, the uncertainty she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. She was not just a flight attendant anymore, she was a woman who had learned a valuable lesson about humility, and now, she was going to make it right. "Sir," she began, her voice steady, "I must inform you that we have an extremely important person in business class who should truly be in first class. Mr. Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso, is currently seated there. Would you be willing to move to business class for the remainder of the flight?" Her words hung in the air for a moment, and Sophie could see the shock registering in Mr. Damari's eyes. His expression went from surprise to awe, and then to a deep understanding. Sophie noticed how quickly his initial irritation faded, replaced by an eagerness to comply. "The president?" he asked, as though verifying what he had just heard. "Of Burkina Faso?" "Yes, sir," Sophie replied, her voice filled with quiet pride. "The president." Without another word, Mr. Damari immediately began gathering his things, his demeanor now one of nervous compliance. Of course, I'll move right away," he said, almost tripping over his words in his haste. Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of irony as she watched him scramble. The same man who had once made her ask Ibrahim Traore to move was now more than willing to give up his seat. His change of heart was so immediate, and yet, Sophie couldn't help but notice how easily power shifted in the presence of a title. She was no longer surprised by how quickly people were willing to align themselves with power and prestige once they realized its true source. She turned back to Ibrahim, who was still sitting calmly in his seat, reading his book. The image of him, so composed and unassuming, was a stark contrast to the flurry of activity that had erupted around him. Sophie hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to address him formally or casually. But there was no avoiding it now, she had to make it right. "Mr. President," she said, her voice lower but full of respect. "We would like to invite you to return to your seat in first class for the rest of the flight." Ibrahim looked up at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Ah, so you found out who I am," he said, his voice light, almost as if he was amused by the turn of events. Sophie, feeling a rush of warmth in her cheeks, nodded. "Yes, Mr. President, and I am so sorry for what happened earlier." I made a mistake, and I deeply regret it. Ibrahim held up a hand, his smile still gentle. It doesn't matter, he said calmly, his tone soothing. I told you before, it's not important. I am comfortable here. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat as his words sank in. How could he be so understanding, so humble in the face of such a mistake? It was almost more than she could process. She felt compelled to insist. It's not about comfort, or titles, Mr. President. It's about the respect you deserve. Please, allow us to honor you in the way you should be. Ibrahim thought for a moment, his eyes thoughtful, before nodding. All right, he said quietly, standing up and following her down the aisle. He moved slowly, as if not to disrupt the stillness around him, and Sophie couldn't help but notice how people's gazes followed him, filled with reverence. Even those who didn't know who he was could sense the quiet strength emanating from him. As they walked through the cabin to the front, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This man, whom she had initially misjudged, had given her the gift of understanding, a lesson in humility that would stay with her forever. She guided him to his seat in first class, her heart full of respect for the quiet leader who had shown her the true meaning of dignity. Before the plane touched down in Ouagadougou, Sophie approached Ibrahim one last time. Mr. President, she said softly, her voice full of gratitude, thank you for this lesson. I will never forget it. Ibrahim smiled, his eyes filled with kindness. We are all teachers and students in this life, Miss Lur, he said. The important thing is to remain open to the lessons we receive. As the plane began its final descent, Sophie looked out the window at the twinkling lights of Ouagadougou below, feeling a deep sense of peace settle within her. She had learned something invaluable on this flight, and it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life: the power of humility, the importance of respect, and the understanding that true greatness is often found in the simplest of gestures.